Okay guys, welcome back. Last video that we did, we talked about how to set dress some of this environment, this claymation style environment that I'm going for. Um, Last video, as I mentioned before, we talked about using the mesh network to help set dress and put all of these kind of shrubs and boulders and blobs into our scene. And now we're going to talk about bringing it into Substance Painter and surfacing it in a claymation or a hand-molded clay style of textures. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. This is a little bit off the cuff and I apologize about that. But what I've done off camera just to help speed things up is I've combined everything. And before we spit this out, we got to make sure that our UVs are all painted in. So that's a very, very, very important portion of this. So I'm going to take these guys and have them arranged in UDIMs, which means I'm using multiple UV shells, kind of like so. And in these 4 shells, making sure that nothing is kind of overlapping or spilling out too far. So maybe I'll just shrink these down a little bit. I'm going to bring everything in as one asset just for the sake of time. You can have these as like separate objects or separate assets and kind of reference them in one at a time, which honestly might be a better move. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to bring all of this in at once. That way you guys can see holistically what is going on. So a very crucial and important step that I'm not showing here that I do want to remind you guys to do is UV unwrap these assets for texturing. But once we've done that, I'm going to export this whole thing as a selection as an FBX file. That way, when we come in to Substance Painter, we can, let's do this. Let me drag this into the other screen. Create a new asset. We're going to select our object right here. And since we're using UDIMs or multiple UV tiles, we're going to leave this checked and I'm not going to mess with anything else. We're going to hit OK. And now we've got our objects in here. Now you'll notice this is pretty jagged, and that's because if we look back at our objects in rough mode, you'll see it is very, very jagged, and we want to fix that. So I have already titled this Enviro Low because I'm going to make a duplicate and I'm going to call this Enviro High. And what we're going to do is make a high poly duplicate. So I want the environment high poly to look as if it's smooth like this, but just through geometry alone. So let's go back to our high poly version, and with everything selected, I'm going to hit smooth. And as you can see, it has kind of exponentially increased the amount of geometry that we've gotten here, and so now we are kind of getting to a more smooth texture. It's not quite there yet, so maybe I'll just click it one more time, and this is looking pretty good, right? So this looks very similar to how this version looks in rough mode with just geometry alone doing it. So with all that said and done, now I can take this high poly version and repeat my process. So export selection, I'm going to replace the high poly FBX over here. In my Substance Painter, I'm just going to re-import mesh. And that's going to pull the same FBX directory. Let's see if that'll work, or I can just make a new one. There we go. All right, so now we are good to go. Okay, so I just realized that I had accidentally saved it as a different version. So now that we've got this in, the first thing we want to do is we want to bake our selected textures, and this is going to extract all of the information off of curvature, ID, normals from Maya, and it's going to go ahead and process all of that through. So this is going to make it very, very helpful for making smart materials, which is what we're going to be doing today. So it's going to take a little bit of time, but once it's done, we can return to painting mode, and now we've got you'll see it looks a little bit different. It looks a little bit nicer, and that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to make a fill layer, and this layer is going to call this grass 1 or ground 1. And I want this to look as if it's green clay. So I'm going to change the color. I can right click on the screen, and I can dial this to appear as this kind of bright, maybe kind of like this. I want it to look like Play-Doh. So we'll just grab this green color, and it's getting there. So the roughness, you can also dial this down. This helps make it more matte or more rough. are glossy. Since it's not a metallic object that I'm making, I'm going to leave this as black or 0, and we'll be good to go there. I'm going to make another layer on top of this, and this is going to help add a little bit of like bumpiness or kind of displacement variation. So I've got another fill layer up here, and we're going to call this bump variation 1 right there. And I'm going to add a black mask, and that black mask says nothing is affected except for if we add a fill layer underneath. I can add, let's look for something like that mask, this black and white image, and this will help kind of identify what's going to show through and what's not. So what I really want is I really want a mask that kind of makes these kind of bumps and folds, like pops through like so, and I can turn up the tiling so that way I can see a little bit more of this. That's getting there, right? So I'm kind of liking that the way this is looking, and what I can do is I can dial the height down, and that's going to give it kind of this jaggedy, bumpy look. Now this is a little bit sharp, so something I'm going to do in here is I'm going to add a filter, and this bevel filter is just going to help kind of ease off on some of those bumps, right? So it's looking a little bit stylized right now, but it's going to kind of chamfer those areas in which I don't necessarily want them to be too extreme. So now that I've got them kind of carving in and about on themselves, I'm going to add one last filter, which is going to be my blur filter, and that's just going to soften everything so that way it's not too extreme. So that's looking pretty interesting, right? And what I can do is I can duplicate this and kind of add more variation by replacing this new image with something like that. And let's go ahead and turn on color just so that you guys can see what's going on. But now I can add these kind of pools of variation right in there that are affecting the height, right? So I can pull this up, and now it's kind of like extruding out a little bit more. All right. So we've got a lot of these masks that we can kind of play around with to help kind of give us the look that we want, and this is kind of feeling pretty fun. So I'm going to turn off my color again, or I can change my color to be maybe the same but a little bit brighter. There we go. That's feeling pretty good. Okay. And now we've just got a little bit of variation in here as well, which I always really like. So nothing too extreme like this, and we're just going to kind of eyeball it until we get kind of the look that we want. So this is kind of getting closer to that Play-Doh kind of style that we want. I'm going to add another layer on top of this, and we're going to make it red for now. But I want some like wrinkles and fingerprints and, you know, some kind of artifacting that comes from just modeling like Play-Doh and putty by hand. So we're going to do the same process as before. On this layer, we're going to add a black mask, and then we're going to add a fill layer. And in this fill layer, I'm going to look for something that's like fingerprints. So let's see. That one's looking pretty good. Let's try this guy in here, and let's turn the tiling up to like 10, just so that as we can see. Or maybe 5. We'll see if 5 does anything, right? And we can crank up or down the balance. And I'm going to use this to help show how big or how small I want these smudges to be on my particular object right there. So if I want to, I can turn off color and boost up roughness, and also boost up height. And maybe that's how I can get some of these fingerprints or some of these smudges on my object. Now it's looking a little bit grainy, so I'm going to add a filter on top of this, and we're just going to use a bevel filter to help kind of soften up some of those edges right there. Let's see. We'll make sure to add it on this side. There we go. So now I've got a little bit of roughness variation in there too, which is always kind of nice to see. But you can always play around with that a little bit more to kind of get the look that we want, right? So now that's kind of feeling a little bit more of like clay, which I'm really liking. We're going to do a couple of last things. We're going to add a layer on the top. Again, black mask, we're going to add a generator this time, and this generator is going to pull off of some information such as curvature on our objects, right? And what that's going to do is it's going to identify kind of these areas in which curvature is more extreme, like so. And I'm going to turn on blur so it's not too sharp or noticeable. And all that this guy is going to be is it's going to be a soft light layer in which I'm going to turn off everything else except for color. And that's just going to help kind of tone out some of this. There we go. Some of these areas of high contrast. So that's going to feel nice. I'm going to call this like light curves. And I'm also going to add an ambient occlusion layer, which for me, this is going to be, I'm going to use like this blue, very vivid blue, and I'm going to turn off everything except for color. And I'm going to also add a black mask, and we're going to add a generator, but this generator is going to be called ambient occlusion. And so you'll notice it's going to start finding these areas like these pits underneath, these pockets, and it's going to mask those out. But I'm going to invert this, and then I'm going to turn this from a normal layer to a multiply layer. So that way I can get some of these nicer dark shadows, and I really like these, right? So you can see just it doesn't take too much, but it helps give a little bit of kind of color variation that we always like to see with objects like this. You can also change this to an overlay layer. Overlay is also pretty nice to kind of get these ambient occlusion layers. But we could do that to just kind of give a little bit more softer shadows in these kinds of areas. So those are always really nice. Let's see, I'm also going to duplicate my light curvature copy because I'm going to call this shadow curvature. And these are going to be like my really, really dark areas. So instead of soft light, I'm going to change this to multiply. And you can already see what it's doing, but for my curvature layer, I need to invert it. So that way I get something like this, right? And I can dial this kind of up or down depending on what I need. And you can see it's really going to start finding those pockets and those areas of curvature, you know, and to kind of like crank those down a little bit, right? So that's kind of fun. This multiply layer, I don't necessarily want it to be too strong or too intense, but I'm just going to leave it in there for a little bit. And I'm also going to add a filter in there that's a blur filter, just to kind of soften up some of those areas, right? So now I've got something that looks a little bit more like this. And that's super fun, right? So there we go. So I've got some shadows, I've got some light curves that we've got going on here. And all that this is just going to do is give ourselves some color variety, you know, with ultimately just a very solid color, right? So with all that said and done, I'm going to make some folders, and we're going to call this one base materials, and we're going to put our 3 base materials in here. And then I'm going to call a new folder lighting, and we're going to put this at the top. And now we're just going to kind of move some of these into each other, just so that way we can have them. right, and there we go. Let's see. Let's also change this to maybe a vivid light. No, we can leave these out. They'll be separate. It'll be okay. Big folder. I'm going to select all of these, drop them in here, and I'm going to call this Claymation 1. Right? So now this is a smart material that gets to work as a standalone piece. So I can right click this and hit create a smart material, which is right here. And now it's going to be in my library of smart materials that I've made that I can use. So in my case here, I'm going to create a black mask, and I'm just going to now unmask objects in which I want to be green. Right, so maybe these guys, like maybe these tufts of trees up here. And I'm using the mesh fill tool. That's right there. And if I want to, I can drop a new layer underneath. And instead, this layer is going to be, if I bring all of this down, I'm going to make this like a gray, kind of blue colored for my rocks. And so I'm looking at this area down here. I can even turn off the other layer up from above. And I want something that's a little bit more rocky colored. So something very neutral, but you know, still kind of with these warmths and with these cools, I think would be kind of fun. You know, just to kind of carve these in a little bit more. Maybe not anything too extreme. And I'm just going to kind of play around with this a little bit more. There we go. I still want it to feel like Play-Doh, so Play-Doh doesn't have quite as much contrast as, you know, what it's currently there right now. So I'm just going to kind of make sure that these guys are fairly close to each other. Right. Okay, that's getting there. There we go. I think that did it. So now I'm going to kind of repeat the same step, and we're just going to click on these particular objects that we want to be Play-Doh or kind of rock colored, right? So maybe all of these guys over here. I can even select a bunch of these, right, if I wanted to. Right, kind of like this. I did select the ground plane, so I do need to deselect that. And now we're good there. I'm going to call this rocks, right? But I can kind of rinse and repeat these steps to create, let's see, branches or wood. I'm going to call this wood over here. And let's go ahead and just modify this to be more of like a brown color, right? So I want a dark orange, something about right there. Same thing here. Maybe we'll lighten this up, and then same thing right there. Maybe not too yellow, but somewhere in the middle. There we go. That's a nice brown clay colored. And then add black mask, and we're just going to select our trees. May come back, deselect this guy here. Get all of our tree branches in there. Can't forget any of them. All right, there we go. Almost done. And then finally, I'll add one more of these guys in here just to give me maybe like a more kind of a darker green color for like little tufts of grass that we have stylized in there. So I'm just going to come down here and maybe lower everything so that way it's just a little bit more of a value change. And then we'll add a black mask, and whichever ones that I haven't colored in already, we're just going to select those. And this will be the last step that we may need. Right, so let's just double check. This guy, this guy, this guy. Right there. And maybe a couple of these. Just to kind of give it some color variation. All right, let's see how it looks. There we go. So now I've got this whole setup kind of in this appearance of as if it was made with like clay, and I think it's working out pretty well. It's really fun to kind of make these stylized materials, right? And you don't have to stop there. You can always kind of go through, and if you want this to have like a very specific kind of look to it, adding more of these layers, right, that we've been doing from before. If I add another fill, you've got so many different filters in here that are just a lot of fun to use, right? So it's kind of fun to just get creative and see, all right, what filters might really benefit what we're trying to make, right? Maybe clouds would be kind of fun to further modify what we've got going on here. If I turn off the roughness and bring up the height, right now I've got kind of this bumpy, rocky texture, which might be kind of fun. That will, just kind of help bring out some of these shadows and things like that. So we can really kind of play around with the look that we're trying to make just with some of these filters alone. I'm actually going to come back here and see if I can find any other fingerprint ones that we can add in, because I think those are a lot of fun. So let's see, let's get rid of this and let's continue to look for, I'm going to use this library over to the right or the left side of me, and we're just going to go to masks, and we're going to look for some very fun fingerprints or kind of wrinkle icons just over here that we can potentially use. So looking through these masks, there's some that we could use, some that maybe we don't need to. It just depends on what exactly we're trying to make. But I'm just going to look for something that will give me a little bit more of a kind of a unique shape to it. So directional noise, we don't exactly need that. Dirt, grime, these might be kind of fun. Dirt leak, we'll try that, right? We can put it in here and we can see just kind of like what look we're getting out of it, especially in this particular shape right here. So if I like the look of this, then something I can do is I can, turn off the color and then maybe dial down and now we've got kind of these pits that are in here, which might be kind of fun, right? If I add a filter just to kind of bevel it off so it's not too extreme, then that might be kind of a nice look for getting the bumpiness out into our object. Maybe we'll blur it a little bit, right? So we can kind of play around with this. Now, once we're finally done with all of this, we're going to export our selected textures. And so as we do this, we've gone through this process before, but I'm just going to go to my RenderMan Pixar surface. I've made a copy for myself that you guys can as well. But let me go ahead and find my VDEV rig source images, and I'm going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this Claymation demo, and select that folder as a directory for it to spit in all of these images. So they're PNGs. If you are curious to learn more about the settings that we're playing with, there's another video that I have on them. Be sure to check that out. But once all of this is set up, we can hit export. And now we're all done and dusted. So the last video is going to be talking about putting all of these textures back into Maya and creating our materials with Pixar surfaces, and then of course rendering them through Pixar RenderMan. So stay tuned for that video. It should be out shortly. But until then, if you have any questions, just let me know. I will see you guys later. Bye-bye.